Jordan Vance stands 5'7" in sensible black flats, her face a mask of total composure as she prepares to shatter 7 months of perfect invisibility. She doesn't just see the danger. She smells it. Rotting almonds and copper, the unmistakable chemical signature of cyanide buried deep within a 2016 Château Latour. As the head of the Baek-ho Syndicate reaches for his glass, Jordan moves before her brain can even approve the choice. Her palm hits the table with a definitive thud, her voice low and measured, cutting through the gold light and soft jazz. "Don't drink that wine, sir." In that single second, she stops being a ghost in the room and becomes the only woman the most dangerous man in Seoul refuses to let go. If you want to see how a culinary student from Chicago becomes the most vital weapon for a Korean mafia boss, don't miss a single chapter of this high-stakes story. Subscribe for more gripping tales of mystery and romance. Like this video if you enjoyed Jordan's quick thinking. Share this channel with your friends who love a good thriller. She stopped. She had one job that night. Keep her head down. Smile.
Pour the wine.
Collect the tip. Go home. She did all of those things. Except for one. Jordan Vance had spent the last 7 months perfecting the art of disappearing. Not literally, but close enough. She was 26 years old, standing 5'7" in sensible black flats, with deep brown skin, thick natural hair pinned tight under a hotel-issued cap, and the kind of face that knew how to go completely blank on command. She had learned that trick young, back in Chicago, in a house where the wrong expression at the wrong moment could change the temperature of an entire room. She had learned it the way you learn things that no one teaches you, by surviving. Seoul had not been the plan. Seoul had been the escape. After her father died, quietly, the official report said, "A lab accident. Nothing suspicious, move along." Jordan had packed 2 bags, deferred her final culinary semester, and put an ocean between herself and everyone who had ever said her father's name like it was something to apologize for. She had found a sublet in Mapogu, a neighborhood that smelled like sesame oil and motor exhaust and rained on concrete, and she had told herself she was just resetting, just breathing, just giving herself space to figure out what she was supposed to do next. She had found the job at the Latte Signal Hotel on her 3rd week in Seoul, when her savings had started making a sound she didn't like. The interview had been short. She had good references, better posture, and something the head of the service staff had called, in careful English, a very composed manner. What he meant was that she didn't react to things visibly. What he didn't know was that she was reacting to absolutely everything. All the time. Constantly. She just never showed it. That was the other thing about Jordan Vance that nobody in Seoul knew. She could smell what other people couldn't. Not in a metaphorical way. Not in the way people say they can smell trouble or sense a liar from a mile off. Literally. Physiologically. Since she was a small girl sitting at her father's kitchen table watching him work through chemical compounds like some people work through crossword puzzles, she had possessed a sensory ability that no doctor had ever given a satisfying name to, though the closest term was synesthesia, a crossing of the wires, a merging of inputs that shouldn't merge. For Jordan, it meant that certain chemical compounds had a smell that bypassed her nose entirely and landed somewhere deeper, somewhere that felt less like scent and more like sound, like color, like a bell struck in a room she couldn't leave. Cyanide, for instance, smelled to Jordan like rotting almonds dipped in copper, like pennies and ruin. She had known that since she was 11 years old, when her father had said, very gently, that her nose was a gift and she should never let anyone make her feel otherwise. She thought about him often in Seoul. She thought about him especially on nights like this one. The kind of night where the hotel was dressed in its best, where the chandeliers threw gold light against crystal, and the jazz trio in the corner played something that sounded like money felt, and the air was thick with the kind of tension that expensive rooms get when the people inside them are dangerous. She was working the VIP lounge. 6th floor. The kind of floor where the carpet was so thick your feet made no sound, and the menus had no prices. She had been assigned to table 9 at 8 p.m., and by 8:15 she had cataloged everything worth knowing about it. The way the 3 men seated there had positioned themselves, 2 with their backs to the wall, 1 at the angle that covered the entrance. The way the man in the center sat with the stillness of someone who had been still for so long it had become his natural state. The ink that climbed his throat like a sentence that started at his chest and had not yet finished being written. The way his eyes, when they moved, did not move the way curious eyes move. They moved the way a scanner moves. Systematic.
Filing.
Inventorying. Jordan had looked once, and then looked away. She knew exactly who Han Seo-jun was. Every member of the hotel staff did, though no one said his name above a murmur, and no one held his gaze for longer than 2 seconds. He was the head of the Baek-ho Syndicate, and the Baek-ho Syndicate was, depending on who you asked, either a private investment group with extensive Seoul holdings or the reason certain judges drove foreign cars they couldn't explain, and certain police commissioners took long vacations in November. Jordan was not paid to have opinions about any of that. She was paid to pour water, present menus, and remain invisible. She was doing all three when the sommelier arrived. His name was Cha Min-yuk. He had worked the VIP floor for 11 years. He had an award in a glass case in the staff room. He moved through the lounge with the unhurried authority of someone who has never once doubted his right to be where he is, and he was carrying a bottle of 2016 Château Latour by the neck the way you carry something sacred. Jordan watched him pass, and the smell hit her like a door opening onto something rotten. It was faint. Most people would not have noticed it at all. It was buried under the wine's tannins and the ambient scent of the room, tucked down in the chemistry of the bottle the way a wrong note is tucked inside a chord. But Jordan noticed it. Jordan always noticed it. The almonds. The copper. The specific signature of something that should not be in a glass of wine. She stopped moving. Her tray was in her hand. Her face was still. Her heart had just kicked into a gear she hadn't felt since the last time she stood in a Chicago hospital waiting room and understood, before the doctor even spoke, that the news was bad. Cha Min-yuk reached table 9. He set the bottle on the white linen with great ceremony. He produced a corkscrew. He opened the wine with the practiced ease of a man who has done this 10,000 times. Jordan had perhaps 30 seconds. She stood in the middle of the VIP lounge of the Lotte Signal Hotel, 26 years old, 7 months into a life she had built entirely around being overlooked, and she understood, with the cold clarity of someone whose instincts had never once lied to her, that the man at the center of table 9 was about to drink something that would kill him. And she understood something else, too. Something that scared her more than the poison. She was going to stop him. She moved before her brain finished approving the decision. Her shoes made no sound on the carpet. She crossed the lounge in 12 steps, weaving between tables with a fluency that came from months of navigating tight spaces, carrying things she couldn't drop, and she arrived at table 9 at the exact moment Cha Min-yuk set the poured glass of Château Latour in front of Han Seo-jun. Seo-jun's hand moved toward it. Jordan set her palm flat on the table. "Don't drink that wine, sir." The words came out low, measured, like she was reading them from somewhere inside herself that didn't shake. The entire table went still. Not the casual stillness of people who have been interrupted. The absolute, pressure-sealed stillness of men who have been trained to assess threats before they breathe. 2 sets of eyes landed on her like weight. The bodyguards. She felt them without looking. She kept her eyes on Seo-jun. He had not moved. He had not reached for the glass, and he had not pulled back from it. He was simply present. Completely, disturbingly present, in a way that made the air around him feel denser than the rest of the room. Up close, the ink at his collar resolved into detail, a crane mid-flight on the left side of his neck, its wing disappearing below the fabric of his shirt. His jaw was clean-cut. His hands, resting on the table, were utterly still. His eyes, when they moved to her face, were the color of dark water over stone, and they did exactly what she'd suspected they would do. They did not react. They observed. She was being filed. She could feel it happening. He was looking at her the way her father had once looked at a compound under a lens, with total absence of judgment and total presence of attention, taking her apart piece by piece and storing every piece somewhere precise. The silence stretched. Jordan did not fill it. She had learned in the particular school of difficult rooms that the person who speaks first into a silence like this one loses something. Finally, Seo-jun said, "On what basis?" 2 words. Level as concrete. Jordan reached into everything she knew. She did not gesture toward the glass. She did not let her eyes leave his.
It smells wrong, she said.
The base notes of the wine are correct, but there is something underneath them that does not belong there. Something chemical. I noticed it before it was poured.
A beat.
The jazz trio in the corner finished a song and started another. You noticed it before it was poured, Seo-jun said. Not a question. Not skepticism. Just repetition, slow and deliberate, the way a person repeats something back when they are determining whether it is true. Yes, sir. He looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough to make her aware of her own heartbeat. Then he turned to the sommelier. Cha Min-hyuk had not moved. He stood exactly where a sommelier stands after a pour, with the bottle at his side and his face arranged in the professional blankness of a man pretending very hard to feel nothing. His hands, Jordan noticed now, were not quite still. The left one, gripping the bottle, had a tension in the knuckles that the rest of his body was working to contradict. She could smell it on him, too. Not the poison, something else. Sour and sharp and bright, cutting through his cologne like a wire. Fear, processed through adrenaline. The specific chemistry of someone who has already decided what they're going to do, and is now watching the moment their plan begins to unravel. Seo-jun looked at Cha Min-hyuk for exactly 3 seconds. Then, with no change in his expression, no change in his voice, he said one word in Korean to the man on his right. Jordan did not speak Korean. She did not need to. The bodyguard rose from his chair.
Cha Min-hyuk bồn tét.
He made it 4 steps before the second bodyguard, who had been standing near the entrance and whom Jordan had not even clocked as a bodyguard, stepped into his path with the quiet efficiency of a door closing. The lounge had gone very still. The other guests were the kind of people who knew how to make themselves appear to be looking somewhere else. The jazz trio played on. Seo-jun still had not touched the glass. He looked back at Jordan. And for a moment, she had the disorienting sensation of being the only thing in the room that was visible. Sit down, he said. I'm working, Jordan said. You are working, he said. Sit down. She had expected many things. A dismissal. A thank you delivered through a PR filter, polite and weightless. Perhaps a check. The kind of gesture that says we acknowledge this happened, and now we would prefer that it didn't. She had not expected the room. It was on the same floor as the lounge, behind a door she had walked past 100 times and assumed was a utility closet. It was not a utility closet. It was small and white and contained 2 chairs, a table, and a quality of silence that made her understand immediately that this room existed for a specific kind of conversation. Seo-jun came in 3 minutes after she did. He was alone. He sat across from her with the easy authority of someone who owns every room he enters, whether or not his name is on the deed, and he looked at her without speaking for long enough that another person might have filled the silence out of sheer discomfort. Jordan did not fill it. She folded her hands on the table and looked back. How did you know? He said. I told you how. You told me what, not how. He tilted his head slightly. My security detail includes 2 men with 18 years of combined field experience. There are 3 cameras covering the bar at all times. The wine was pulled from a sealed storage unit 30 minutes before service. By what mechanism did a girl with a tray notice something that all of that missed? The phrase landed with a weight she suspected was intentional. She noted it and set it aside. I have a sensitivity to chemical compounds, she said. Certain substances have a distinct sensory signature for me. I can detect them where other people can't. He was quiet. You smelled cyanide, he said. I smelled something consistent with a cyanide compound, yes. At a concentration low enough to be undetectable by standard means, but sufficient to be lethal given the volume of wine in that glass. Something shifted in his expression. Barely. She would have missed it if she had blinked. It was not surprise. She was coming to understand that Seo-jun did not experience surprise the way other people did. It was more like the look of someone who has placed a piece into a puzzle and found that it fits somewhere unexpected. You know the dose threshold, he said. My father was a chemist. Was. He died 2 years ago. He absorbed this without commentary. His eyes had not left her face since he sat down. Your name, he said. Jordan Vance. American. Yes. How long in Seoul? 7 months. And before Seoul?
She paused.
Chicago. He said nothing. But the words sat differently between them after she said it, and she had the distinct and unsettling feeling that it meant something to him that she had not intended it to mean. He leaned back in his chair. He laced his hands together and regarded her with the patience of someone who has nowhere to be and no interest in pretending otherwise. "The sommelier," he said finally. "What did you observe?" She told him. The knuckle tension. The micro-adjustment in his posture after the pour. The smell, not the chemical smell of the poison, but the organic chemistry of acute stress, which she could detect the same way she detected everything else, through that interior register that had no name and needed none. Seo-jun listened to every word without interrupting. It was, she would think later, the most attentively anyone had ever listened to her in her life. Not with warmth, not with sympathy, but with a specific and absolute quality of attention that made her feel, strangely, like what she was saying mattered. Like she was not being managed, like she was being heard. When she finished, he said, "The sommelier has been on my staff for 11 years. Yes. You are certain?" "I am certain of what I observed," she said. "You're the one who has to decide what it means." Another long pause. Then, quietly, "You are either the most dangerous coincidence I've ever encountered, or the most useful one." Jordan met his gaze. "I'm a culinary student from Chicago. I have no interest in your business, your enemies, or your syndicate politics. I smelled something that was going to kill you, and I stopped it. That's all this is." Seo-jun looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I know." He said it the way someone says a thing when they have already decided what to do with it. He did not let her go home that night. He told her this with the same tone he would use to say that it was raining outside and she might want an umbrella, a tone that acknowledged inconvenience without apologizing for it, because the decision had already been made and the conversation was informational, not negotiable. "The people who wanted me dead know that you stopped it," he said. "They will know by morning if they do not know already. You are a liability they will want to eliminate." Jordan stared at him across the white table in the white room. "I'm a hotel employee. You were. The version of you that was just a hotel employee ended 40 minutes ago." She wanted to argue with this. She looked for the angle from which it was wrong, turned it over the way her father had taught her to turn over any proposition that came dressed as a fact. She found nothing. He was correct, and the correctness of it settled over her like something cold and heavy. "So, what are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying that going home tonight would be inadvisable. I'm saying that the most logical solution to the problem of your safety is for you to be where my people are, until I have neutralized the people who created this situation." "That's not a solution," Jordan said. "That's a different kind of problem." "Yes," Seo-jun agreed. "But it is the kind of problem you survive." She looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing in his face that was cruel, nothing that was threatening. There was only that same complete and unsentimental clarity, the clarity of a man who has spent his entire life navigating a world with very few options and has become extraordinarily skilled at assessing which ones are worth taking. She thought about her apartment in Mapogu, the sublet with the good light and the small kitchen and the window that looked out over a street that was always doing something. She thought about the 2 bags she had packed in Chicago and how they had contained, between them, everything she was willing to carry from one chapter to the next. She thought about her father, about the lab accident that wasn't an accident, about the notebook she had never opened because she had already understood, at some level she was not ready to visit, that what was inside it would require her to keep knowing things she'd rather not know. She thought about the word Chicago and the way it had sat between them. "How long?" she said. "As long as is necessary. That's not a number." "No," he said. "It isn't." Jordan looked at her hands, flat on the table. Still. They were always still. She had trained them that way. "I want it on record," she said quietly, "that I did not choose this." "Noted," Seo-jun said. And that was how Jordan Vance, 26 years old, culinary student, accidental hero, walked out of a utility closet conversation and into a life she had not applied for. The estate in Hanamdong was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something cold. All steel and surveillance cameras and the specific aesthetic of power that expresses itself through the absence of color. She had imagined a place that felt like a warning dressed up as a home. What she found was something stranger, and, in its own way, more unsettling. The estate was beautiful. It sat above the Han River on a slope of land that the city seemed to have agreed to leave alone, and it was surrounded by the kind of deliberate quiet that a certain level of wealth can purchase and maintain. The interior was high-ceilinged and spare, but the sparseness was curatorial rather than cold. Every piece of furniture looked chosen rather than placed, and the walls, where they weren't glass, held art that Jordan kept catching herself standing in front of longer than she meant to. She was given a room on the second floor. It had its own bathroom, a window that faced east, and a desk that was bolted to the floor, which she chose not to think too hard about. She was not kept. She was not quite free. She decided, something in between. A guest whose invitation had not been entirely voluntary, in a house whose hospitality was genuine and whose exits were politely, consistently blocked. She learned the estate's rhythms the way she learned any environment, through observation, through patience, through the particular kind of attention that her father had called listening with your whole body. She learned which of the staff were warm and which were professional. She learned that Seo-jun woke before 5 and was in his study before 6, and that he ate breakfast alone, and that he moved through his own house like someone who was used to being the only fixed point in a room full of moving parts. She met Sora on the third day, the estate's manager, a woman in her 50s with a posture like a ruler and a manner that was simultaneously the most professional and the most human thing Jordan had encountered since arriving. Sora told her, without warmth and without cruelty, exactly how the household operated, what was expected of her, and which rooms she was not to enter unaccompanied. The library was not on that list. She found it on the fourth day, at the end of a hallway she had not yet explored, behind a door that was not locked. She pushed it open and stood in the entrance for a moment, adjusting to it the way your eyes adjust to sudden light. It was not a decorative library. It was not the kind of room that exists to communicate taste to guests. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls and were packed with the organized chaos of actual use. Books pulled at angles, slips of paper marking pages, a reading lamp positioned with the specificity of someone who uses it for hours at a stretch. The categories were, at first glance, bewildering. Military strategy, botanical taxonomy, classical history, pharmacology, architectural theory, Korean poetry. 2 full shelves of toxicology, which should have surprised her, and did not. She pulled a volume of classical history off the shelf and read a page at random, standing in the dim light with the house quiet around her. That one has a margin note on page 47 that is incorrect. She did not startle. She turned, steadily, toward the doorway. Seo-jun was leaning against the frame with the ease of someone who has found exactly what he expected to find. He was not in a suit. He wore dark trousers and a collarless shirt, and without the formality of the hotel lounge he looked, not softer, but more precise. Like a word that had shed its punctuation and revealed its actual shape. Which argument is wrong? Jordan said. The one about Mithridates, he said. The author claims the immunization regimen was a myth. The primary sources indicate otherwise. Jordan looked down at the book. You've read the primary sources. I have an interest in the subject. She looked up at him. Botanical poisons. Among other things. She thought about that for a moment, about a man who ran a criminal syndicate and kept a library and had correct opinions about ancient toxicology. She was finding, to her ongoing discomfort, that she was unable to make the pieces of Seo-jun resolve into the shape she expected. Every time she found an angle from which he made clean, simple sense, he said, or did something that complicated it. Not deliberately. That was the part that unsettled her. He wasn't performing depth. He simply had it. Why do you know this much about poisons? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Why do you? She met his eyes. My father. He nodded once. Like he already knew. Like the word Chicago was still doing its work between them, slow and patient, waiting for the moment it would have to be explained. There is a section on synesthesia, he said, and nodded toward the far wall. 3rd shelf from the bottom. If you want to understand what you have a little better. Jordan stood in the library with the book in her hands and the estate quiet around her and the river visible through the window, silver and enormous in the early morning light. She stayed in the library for 3 hours. When she finally left, she found a cup of tea on the hallway table outside the door, still warm, placed there at some point she had not noticed, by someone who had chosen not to make a moment out of it. She stood there for a second, looking at it. Then she picked it up and carried it back to her room and sat with it until it was finished. The dinner happened on a Thursday. Jordan knew it was important before anyone told her it was important. She could read the estate the way she read a room, through small shifts, small tensions, the specific quality of silence that falls over a house when the people inside it are preparing for something they are not discussing aloud. The kitchen staff moved faster. Sora walked the hallways twice in an hour. The men at the gate changed positions. By 6 in the evening, 7 of Seo Jun's lieutenants had arrived. Jordan had not been invited to the dinner. She had not been excluded from it either. She existed, still, in that in-between space the estate had made for her. Not staff, not guest, not prisoner, not quite free. She ate in the kitchen, which she had come to prefer anyway, and she was carrying a glass of water back to her room when she passed the dining room doorway and the smell reached her. It was faint, layered under the aroma of the food, the wine, the candles, all the rich, warm chemistry of a formal dinner, and it was wrong in the specific way that wrong things were always wrong to her, not loudly, not obviously, but with a persistence that refused to be ignored. Like a frequency her body picked up before her mind had finished forming the question. She stood in the hallway and sorted through it. The food was clean. The wine she could assess from here, 3 bottles open, all correct, nothing added. She moved through the scent profile of the room systematically, the way her father had taught her to approach any complex mixture, separate, identify, account for each element until you find the one that doesn't belong. She found it on the 3rd pass. It was on a person, not the wine, not the food. A person at that table was carrying a chemical residue on their hands, faint, almost metabolized, the ghost of something that had been handled hours ago and had not fully washed away. The bass note was familiar. Not identical to the night at the hotel, but related. The same family. The same intent. Jordan stood very still in the hallway with her water glass in her hand and her heart doing something careful and controlled in her chest, and she thought about what Seo Jun had said in the White Room. You are a liability they will want to eliminate. She thought about the sommelier, who had worked this estate's events for years. She thought about 11 years of trust, and what it looked like when trust was a costume someone had been wearing. She set the water glass on the hallway table. Then she walked to the dining room entrance and stood there until Seo Jun looked up. He looked up immediately. She had noticed this about him. He always knew when someone entered his peripheral awareness, even when he appeared to be looking somewhere else entirely. His eyes found her face across the table and the room, and he read something in her expression that she had not spoken, and his own face gave nothing back except the slight, almost imperceptible change in the quality of his stillness. He excused himself from the table 2 minutes later. Not abruptly. Not in a way that suggested anything had shifted. He set his napkin down with the unhurried ease of a man stepping away to take a phone call, and he came to her in the hallway, and he stood close enough that his voice, when he spoke, was below the threshold of the room behind him.
Tell me, he said.
She told him. The residue on someone's hands. The chemical signature. The family of compound it belonged to. She could not tell him precisely which person. She could identify direction, proximity, approximate distance, but she could not, from the hallway, point to a face. I need to walk through the room, she said. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him running the calculation, the risk of bringing her in, the risk of not. The weight of not knowing against the weight of exposing what she could do to a room full of people whose loyalty was currently, apparently, in question. Stay behind me, he said. We're looking at the artwork. He went back in first. She followed 10 seconds later, carrying her water glass, walking with the composed, unhurried ease of a woman who has absolutely nothing to hide, because the one thing Jordan Vance was extraordinary at was moving through a room like she was not moving through a room. She walked slowly. She let the scent profile assemble itself as she moved, closer now, sharper, the layering resolved by proximity into something she could triangulate. She kept her eyes on the paintings on the far wall. She kept her face open and curious, and completely uninformative. The residue was strongest near the far end of the table. She stopped in front of a landscape painting she had passed 20 times without noticing. She stood there for the length of time it took to appear to be looking at it. Then she turned, naturally, the way a person turns when they feel eyes on them, and she let her gaze move across the faces at the table with the casual neutrality of someone who is simply orienting herself in a room. Third from the left. A man in his late 40s with a close-cut beard and the controlled effect of someone who had been in rooms like this one for many years. His hands were on the table. His expression was correct in every detail. He was looking at his dinner plate. He was the one. She did not stop moving. She completed her slow arc of the room and drifted back toward the door, and she set her glass on the sideboard with a small, apologetic smile directed at no one in particular, and she left. Seo-jun followed 4 minutes later. She told him the name. Or rather, she told him the seat number, and he told her the name, and she watched his face absorb it with a terrible composure of someone for whom this kind of betrayal had stopped being surprising without ever stopping being corrosive. "How long have you known him?" she asked. 16 years, Seo-jun said. She did not say she was sorry. She did not think he wanted that. She thought he wanted exactly what she had given him. The truth, plainly stated, without the softening that would imply he couldn't handle it. He stood in the hallway for a moment with his eyes on the middle distance, and she stood beside him, and the sounds of the dinner continued through the wall, oblivious and warm. "Go to your room," he said finally. "Lock the door." She went. She locked the door. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and listened to the estate, and an hour later she heard, very briefly, the sound of a door opening and closing somewhere below her, and then nothing. In the morning, there were only 6 lieutenants at the breakfast table. No one mentioned the 7th. No one looked at his empty chair. Jordan drank her tea and said nothing, and across the table Seo-jun met her eyes for exactly 1 second before returning to his phone, and in that second she understood, with the complete and uncomfortable clarity that had defined every significant moment of her life, that she had crossed another line she was not going to be able to uncross. She was no longer just a variable. She was a weapon, and weapons, she knew, were never truly free. The balcony was Seo-jun's in the way that certain spaces belong to people who return to them without deciding to, not because they are beautiful, though it was beautiful, but because something in the geometry of the place had become necessary. Jordan found him there on a Wednesday evening, 6 days after the dinner. 2 days after the man with the close-cut beard had ceased to be a problem anyone would need to address. The Han River was doing what it always did. Moving, enormous and unhurried, through the valley of light the city made on either side of it. The sky above it was the particular dark blue of 7 in the evening in autumn in Seoul, the color that falls somewhere between day and night, and belongs to neither. She almost went back inside. She had come out for air, not for company, and there were rules in this house that were not written anywhere, but that she had learned to read the way she read chemistry. Through attention, through patience, through the specific intelligence of someone who has always had to understand environments that were not built for her. But he heard her before she could make the decision, and he turned. And for a moment, he just looked at her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, unhurried, unsentimental. "Stay," he said. Not in order. Not quite. Something in the lower register of both. She stayed. She came to stand at the railing beside him, not quite an arm's length away, and she looked out at the river and let the air move across her face. The cold of it was a particular kind of clean. It smelled like water and concrete and the exhaust of a city that never quite stopped, and underneath all of it, very faint, the mineral trace of autumn beginning its slow work on everything green. They stood in silence for a while. She had noticed that silence with Seo-jun was not the kind of silence that demanded to be filled. It was functional. It was what occupied the space between two people who were thinking rather than performing. "Why did you stop me?" he said. She turned her head slightly. He was still looking at the river. "I told you," she said. "You told me the mechanism, not the reason." She considered this. She had considered it herself in the days since. In the small hours of the estate's deep quiet, when the house settled into its nighttime self, and she lay in the east-facing room and let herself ask the questions she usually had the discipline to set aside. "In my world," she said finally, "the people nobody watches are the only ones who see the truth." He turned to look at her then. She felt it, the full weight of that attention finding her, and she held it the way she held most things. Steadily, without drama, without letting it move her more than she was willing to show. "Explain that," he said. "I have spent my whole life being the person who blends into the background," Jordan said. "Waitresses, service staff, people who bring things and take things away. We are in the room for all of it. Every conversation, every meeting, every moment that would stop if anyone remembered we were there. But they don't remember. So we see everything."
She paused.
That night, I was the only person in that room with no stake in the outcome. No loyalty to protect. No position to defend. I just saw what was there. "And you acted on it." "Yes." "Why?" he said. "Not the philosophy. Why, personally? Why did you care whether I lived?" The directness of it landed without warning, the way direct things do when you have been fielding indirect ones. Jordan was quiet for a moment. The river moved below them, indifferent and constant. "I don't know if I'd call it caring," she said carefully. "Not at first. It was more that I could not act. Something in me, the same thing that's always forced me to notice things I'd rather ignore, it doesn't turn off. I saw it, and my body had already made the decision before my brain had finished the risk assessment." "And now," he said. The question sat between them in the cold air. She looked at his profile, the line of his jaw, the ink at his collar that she had long since stopped registering as strange, and now registered simply as part of the specific physical language of him. He was not looking at her. He was giving her the courtesy of the river while he asked the thing that required honesty to answer. "Now," she said, "I think I might care whether you live. A little." The silence that followed was different from the one before it. It had weight to it. The specific weight of something that has been acknowledged and cannot be unacknowledged. He said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, "My father used to say that the only people worth trusting are the ones who had no reason to help you, and helped you anyway. Was he right? He died before I had enough data to evaluate the theory." Jordan turned back to the river. Beside her, Seo Jun did the same. Their hands were both on the railing, close enough that she was aware of the distance between them with the same involuntary precision she brought to everything chemical, measuring, accounting, noting the charge between two elements in proximity. She did not move her hand. Neither did he. They stood there until the city finished its slow conversion to night, and the river went from silver to black, and the lights on either bank multiplied and scattered across the water, like something broken into something beautiful. She went inside first. He let her go. At the doorway she paused, not turning around, and said, "Your father's theory. I think he was right." She heard him, quietly, exhale. She went to her room. She lay on the bed in the dark with her hand still holding the shape of the railing and her chest holding something she had not had a name for in a very long time. It felt, distantly and dangerously, like belonging. She wore dark green. It was the only formal dress she owned. She had packed it from Chicago on impulse, the way you pack things you suspect you might need for occasions you cannot yet name. It fell below the knee, structured at the shoulders, fitted through the body, and it did what good clothing does when it knows the person wearing it. It stopped trying and simply agreed with her. Against her dark skin the color settled like something chosen rather than worn, and when Sora appeared at her door with a pair of heels in the right size, and the expression of someone fulfilling a task rather than expressing an opinion, Jordan accepted them without comment and put them on. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She looked like a woman about to walk into a room she had no business walking into. That had been true for most of her life. The gala was held at a private arts complex in Gangnam, the kind of venue that existed at the precise intersection of culture and money, all polished stone floors and art installations, and a guest list that was, if you knew how to read it, a map of who actually ran Seoul and who was allowed to pretend they did. Seo Jun's attendance was expected. His presence at events like this was itself a form of communication, a message written in body language and calm, broadcast to everyone in the room who understood the language. He arrived with Jordan on his arm. She was aware of the conversations that did not pause but changed pitch when they walked in. She was aware of the precise way eyes moved, the quick assessment, the recalibration, the performance of not staring. She had been an invisible woman for most of her adult life, And this was its inverse, and she found she did not hate it the way she'd expected to. She found it, instead, clarifying. When you are visible, you can see who is looking and where from. Invisibility had been a survival strategy. This was something different. Stay close, Seo-jun said, very quietly, without looking at her. His hand was at the small of her back, light, directional, the touch of someone who is guiding rather than controlling, which she had discovered was exactly how he did everything. I know, she said. The room was enormous and full, and loud in the specific way that rooms full of powerful people are loud. Not with warmth, but with the energy of people performing power for each other, watching and being watched, every gesture a small negotiation. Jordan moved through it beside Seo-jun and did what she always did. She sorted. She sorted through the ambient chemistry of the room the way a musician sorts through noise for a note. She let the familiar signals pass: alcohol, perfume, food, the particular blend of stress hormones that a room full of ambitious people always generated. And she tracked for anything that didn't fit. She was calmer than she'd expected to be. Her father's voice was in her head, the same voice that had sat with her at the kitchen table for years. You are not overwhelmed by what you can detect. You are made for it. Breathe through it. Sort through it. Trust the signal. She trusted the signal. By the time they had made 2 circuits of the room, she had a read on the crowd that was less a list of facts and more a sensory map. Here, the clean chemistry of people who were exactly what they appeared to be. There, the altered profile of someone managing their effect with a precision that read as performance rather than composure. Seo-jun was introducing her to a man in a gray suit whose name she filed and would not forget when she noticed the shift. It came from across the room. Faint but definite, a chemical signature she had not encountered before, and that was the point she realized. Whoever carried it was good. They had masked the obvious traces, had used a base that mimicked the natural compounds of the room's ambient scent profile. But they had not accounted for the specific register of her particular sensitivity, the one that operated below language and reason, the one that her father had called her second nose, and she had spent 26 years learning to read. She pressed her fingers, lightly, once, against Seo-jun's forearm. He did not look at her. He continued his conversation with the man in the gray suit for 30 more seconds. She counted, and then excused himself with the ease of a man who has been excusing himself from conversations that were never really conversations for his entire adult life. They moved toward the bar. He leaned close as though saying something social. Northwest corner, she said, without moving her lips more than necessary. Someone's carrying an accelerant. Not on their skin, on their clothing. Jacket lining, possibly. It's been treated to reduce the scent, but the base compound still reads. She felt him process this. The stillness that came over him was different from his normal stillness. It was the stillness of a man who has received a piece of information and is already 5 moves ahead of it. Accelerant, he said quietly. Not poison. Not just poison, she said. This isn't an assassination. It's a demolition. A beat. Then, can you identify them? Give me 10 minutes, Jordan said. He gave her 11. She had 11 minutes to walk a room full of dangerous people and find the one carrying enough accelerant to make the building a memory. She had done harder things. She had grown up in a house that smelled of grief and chemical compounds and the specific musk of a man who knew more than he was allowed to say, and she had learned to breathe through it. She had crossed an ocean on 2 bags and a decision. She had stood in front of the most powerful criminal in Seoul and told him his wine would kill him. She could do this. She moved through the room with the unhurried ease of a woman who was exactly where she intended to be, and she let her second nose do what it was built to do. The scent map of the room assembled itself as she walked. The accelerant signature shifting in intensity as she moved, now stronger, now fainter, guiding her toward it the way a current guides something that has decided to stop fighting it. She stopped in front of a painting she was not looking at. 3 meters away, a man in a black dinner jacket was speaking to a woman in a silver dress. He was unremarkable in every visible way, medium height, composed face, the kind of groomed anonymity that was itself a choice. He was holding a champagne glass he had not touched. His jacket sat slightly wrong on the left side, just below the pocket, a minor asymmetry, barely visible, The kind you would not notice unless you were looking for it, or unless you had a body that registered every irregular weight distribution the way Jordan's did. She looked at him for long enough to be certain. Then she turned away and found Seo-jun. She said one name, the name he had told her to listen for. The face behind the sommelier, behind the lieutenant at the dinner table, behind weeks of careful positioning. The architect of all of it, standing in a room he had planned to burn. Seo-jun looked at her for 1 second. Then he took out his phone. What followed was not visible to the room. That was the thing about people who operated at Seo-jun's level. They had learned to contain everything that mattered inside gestures so small they looked like nothing. A phone call that looked like a social exchange. A signal to the 3 men positioned near the exits that looked like nothing at all. The room continued its conversation, continued its performance of wealth and power and mutual regard, and underneath it, efficient and invisible, the trap closed. Jordan stood near the bar and watched a man get escorted out of a gala by people who looked like waitstaff, and she breathed, and she did not let her hands shake until she was in the car. Then she let them shake. Seo-jun sat beside her in the back seat and did not say anything. The city moved past the windows, and she pressed the back of one hand against her mouth and breathed through her nose and let the adrenaline finish its work, let it move through her the way a storm moves through, fully, completely, until it was done. After a while he reached across and placed his hand over hers. Still, present, the same way he had signaled 1,000 small things. Without performance, without excess, with only the clean directness of someone saying exactly what they meant. She turned her hand over, let his close around it. They did not speak for the rest of the drive. The building did not burn. Jordan learned this the same way she learned most things now. Through pieces, assembled at an angle, in the estate's breakfast room the following morning with a cup of tea she was holding but not drinking while Sora told her, in the efficient and feeling neutral way Sora told her most things, that the device had been removed from the venue's infrastructure before it could be triggered. That the man in the black dinner jacket was now answering questions in a room that was not the white room, a different room, one she would not be taken to. She sat with that information and understood what it meant. Understood that the weeks of it, the hotel, the dinner, the library, the balcony, the gala, had moved toward this, a completed operation. Finished. The threat neutralized. The traitors identified and addressed. The board cleared. Which meant the reason she was here was over. She went to find Seo-jun. He was in the library. Of course he was. She had come to understand that the library was where he went when something required actual thought rather than performance. He was standing at the window when she came in, the river visible behind him, the morning light gray and clean on the water. She stood in the doorway, and he turned. "It's over," she said. "The immediate threat," he said. "Yes. That's why I'm here." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her the way he always looked at her. Fully, without the social lubrication of indirectness, and she looked back, and between them was everything that the last weeks had built. The white room and the dinner and the balcony and his hand in the car, and the way she had begun to understand the estate's rhythms as intimately as she had ever understood any place she had lived, which was a thing she had not meant to let happen, and had let happen anyway. "You can go," he said. 2 words, the same weight as the first 2 he had ever said to her that mattered. She stood with them for a moment. "I know," she said, "but you're not going." It was not a question. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the thing between them had moved past the territory of question some time ago, past the white room and the dinner table and the balcony, and into something that had no clean word for it. Something that had been building the way things build in silence. Slowly, without announcement, until it was simply there. "My gift," she said. "I spent my whole life calling it a curse. My father called it a gift, and I thought he was trying to make me feel better. I thought it was the thing that made me strange. The thing that meant I always had to be careful, always had to hold back, always had to be invisible so nobody would ask me to explain what I was." She crossed the room toward him. Not quickly. Deliberately, the way she did everything. "Here," she said. "It is what I am. Not a problem. Not something to manage." She stopped close enough that the air between them was warm. Close enough that she could smell the specific and familiar chemistry of him, the cedar of his jacket, the clean mineral note underneath it, the warmth that was just him, that had no compound name she had ever found in her father's notebooks. "I'm not staying because I have nowhere to go," she said. "I'm staying because I'm choosing to." He looked at her for a long moment. The river was behind him, gray and moving and enormous. The library was very quiet. His hands, at his sides, moved toward her, not a reach, not a grasp, just a closing of distance, the same way everything between them had closed, incrementally, over weeks, until incrementally had become simply here. His hand found the line of her jaw, her cheekbone, the angle of her face, turned up toward his.
"Jordan," he said.
Just her name. Just that. She reached up and covered his hand with hers, the way he had covered hers in the car, still, warm, deliberate. She held it there against her face, and she felt his thumb trace the edge of her cheekbone, and the library held them both in its quiet, unhurried way, the books and the morning and the river outside doing nothing except continuing to exist. When she kissed him, it was the same as everything she had done since the night. She put her hand flat on a hotel tablecloth and changed the course of both their lives, fully, without flinching, without calculating the exit. When he kissed her back, it was the same as everything he had ever done. Precise, complete, and unreservedly himself. The library held them. The river moved. The city outside went about its enormous and indifferent business. Later, much later. He said it while she was still close enough that the words were barely sound. She felt them more than heard them. "You are no longer with me by force," he said. "You are with me by choice." Jordan pressed her forehead lightly against his shoulder. His hand was at her back, warm and steady.
"Say it again," she said.
And he did.